Keith Kyle's lifeblood, you remember, was oozing away over this issue of the trade gap.
Yes, well, it is a very serious crisis indeed, because there's been a lot of short-term borrowing from central banks entirely on the assumption that it would be possible to avoid the stop-go business, and that one would in fact be able to go straight ahead with growth, get over this period of limbering the economy up, simply by borrowing money and not stopping the economy because of balance of payments problems. This has failed.
Do you envisage a period of stop-go for the new government?
Well, Labour government can't possibly do that. I don't think it can possibly do devaluation, because there's almost certainly been a gentleman's agreement with the central banks when they put forward this money, which the Labour government will inherit. Therefore, I think Mr. Davenport of The Spectator today is absolutely right in saying there will have to be a combination of things, none of which are very pleasant, all of which are somewhat awkward, all of which will be very difficult for a Labour government with a small majority, things like exchange control, import quotas, and possibly, though this will get us into trouble with the GATT, subsidies on exports, selective subsidies on exports. And this will have to be done straight away.
I'm sure Keith Kyle is right about this. Harold Wilson will start very much as Winston Churchill started in 1951, saying, I cannot, we thought the situation was bad, but really when we look at it, it's much, much worse than we ever suspected. And it's not a bad tactic for a new government to say, now look here, we are in a queer street indeed. This is going to be a tough period of belt tightening and all the rest of it. I would expect Harold Wilson to start on that, because the one thing a government can't do, it's got to take this kind of measure the moment it comes in. It's no good doing it after 6 months.
I mean, for one thing, for example,
Keith always talks in very colourful terms. But all this business about the lifeblood running out, there is, as you know, a blood bank from which we can borrow. And in fact, the amount of borrowing we've done now is only a small proportion of our total borrowing facilities. And what we are doing, in effect, is borrowing time with which to cure the main things. I agree that there are various things we need to do. I would like to see a form of tax reform which would be beneficial to exports and would also act as an incentive to increase productivity. Indeed, I was been putting this forward long before Mr. Wilson ever got onto this.
As an election issue, don't you feel that this whole thing we're talking about now was a Scylla and Charybdis for both parties? Neither of them could really afford to, put the prospect before the
I think that, in particular, Mr. George Brown on his tours around the country was underlining this and saying to the electorate, look here, this is not going to be easy. You can't have all this in heaven too, and it's a bad situation. Yes, I do think the Labour Party played this, and I just want to make one
right, because Maudling was saying exactly the same. This is a difficult situation. So this really
wasn't come so easily from him. I want to just say one thing about the Labour campaign, because we only talked about the Tory campaign, and I think anyone must say, looking back on it, that whatever the result, then what suggestions Nigel Lawson would have, but Harold Wilson fought a copybook campaign in this election.
Yes, and also one of the things he did, of course, was to discount some of the things he knew he would probably have to do when he took office, by, in fact, making something of a breakthrough and in explaining to the people that there was a great crisis coming. This, to some extent, will cover some of the things that he will have to do and some of the things he won't be able to do. I mean, for example, I would think he would not be able to lower the interest rates on housing for at least 12 months because of this situation.
Not at all. I'm surprised that Tony Howe should say he fought a copybook campaign. Obviously, he fought a very effective campaign because he is a very skilled political performer. But to say that the extraordinary suggestion, for example, that the Conservative Party was responsible for fomenting strikes and British Oxygen and Hardy Spicy, remember? I mean, to say that this was a faultless performance, I think comes very strangely.
But as it happened, it provided, I think, the decisive moment of the campaign, Nigel.
Well, that was luck. It was certainly not a copybook performance.
We've heard that song before, though. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise, this kind of issue, is it? Should it in a campaign? This is something one grows accustomed to hearing, this kind of charge.
I would just like to say, agree with one thing Nigel Lawson says. I think that this situation should be described in colourful terms at the moment, because I think it is a colourful situation, and one which must be understood if people are to realise what the new government is up against. However, it is, of course, true, as he says, that we do still have some reserves in the International Monetary Fund. There should be no necessity to be pushed into devaluation if the government decides that is not a policy it wishes to follow.
Can I suggest to you that this vote by the British public, it has shown a hesitancy of a sort. It has failed to give a clear and decisive expression of its own opinion.
I think it's purely negative.
Hasn't it postponed the problems?
I think it's a very bad decision.
No, I don't think you can say this. No one must minimise the achievement the Labour Party has had in the past, well, yesterday really, but the results that have come through. For a left-wing party to win an election in an era of prosperity and affluence, After all, look at what Kennedy had to do in America in 1960. He won by 100,000 votes. This is a great problem.
We'll be back to you in a minute.
So that we can refresh your memories and go to the Press Association State of the Parties Board with Bob Mackenzie.
We're still hanging on the cliff edge, as it were, waiting for the one more that Labour needs for a firm win. I've just been handed a statement by Mr. Len Williams, Labour General Secretary, who said with a smile, "We have an overall majority of 4. I think his calculation is very close to the one we've been using ourselves. He's claiming an overall majority of 4, which is actually 2 less than Labour had in the 1950 election when their majority was 6. Could we look now briefly at the way the votes have been divided up in this election? We're getting pretty near the totals now, though there'll be a few more votes to come. You notice that the division of votes is very close, but Labour with 12 million, just over 12 million, to the Conservatives 11.7 million. And the division in proportions between them is 44.3 for Labour. That compares with 43.8 at the last election. In other words, Labour's share of the vote has gone up by 0.5%. The Conservative share has gone down sharply from 49.4 to 43.4, a 6% drop in the Conservative share of the vote and a 0.5% increase in Labour's share of the vote. Just remind you, look back quickly to 1959. Looking at 1959, that brings out the point I've been making. Conservatives then had a lead of about 6 points over Labour, and now the position has changed, as I just suggested.
David, they're calling you on a little comment.
Well, a large number of things that one can talk about as one tries to analyse this. One of the things that people have been asking about is how much effect did rain yesterday have on the result? Well, we haven't got the meteorological statistics at the time of day it hit various areas. We have tried to see whether the swing varied in different areas or varied with the turnout. And I don't think there really is any evidence that this was the critical thing that upset the Labour result. Another thing that we've been getting queries in about is how much the swing has varied in different regions. Now, the West Midlands has been much the worst area for Labour, but still, overall, over the whole of the West Midlands, there has been a 2% swing to Labour. Scotland, on the other hand, at the other extreme of the regions, big regions we've divided the country into, has a 5% swing. I believe I talked some large degree of nonsense about 3 o'clock in the morning yesterday about Ulster, the swing in Northern Ireland, but that was due to certain problems with the computer, which we will go into. No fault of the computers either. The home counties, a swing above average, 4.2% to Labour, but the really big swings are in smaller areas. Merseyside, every seat in Liverpool swung between 8 and 10% to Labour. The picture is of a national average, a swing in different areas being quite widely divergent. Yet I must say, in defence of the whole concept of swing, every newspaper, every commentator has said 3.5% swing is what Labour needs to win. Well, the last figure I saw, which was based on about 610 results, was a 3.6% swing to Labour, and that has in fact produced a Labour majority only just. But if you can get these things to within 0.1%, there must be a remarkable degree of regularity in the working of the system, swings and roundabouts taken into account. Even if one area diverges one way, another area diverges the other way to make up the average.
A large car is drawn up at the front of number 10 Downing Street. A senior police officer has gone inside. This would suggest that somebody, and who would it be, is about to come out in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So let's go down there temporarily, possibly, to join Michael Barrett and see if he's got some news.
Well, you are coming here temporarily, I think, Richard. We're performing perhaps a little like a yo-yo at the moment. The Prime Minister's car has driven up. We have been pushed back a yard or two, and the word has gone round once again that any second he may come out. But in fact, the information from inside Downing Street is that he will not be out for 3 or 4 minutes yet. So once again, this, if you can see me here, is Michael Barrett in Downing Street.
I have a note here that says Mr. Grimmond has just flown off to Orkney and Shetland, his far distant constituency. And another little note which may interest you, Mr. Quintin Hogg said this afternoon that he'd felt since 1961 that it would be difficult for the Conservatives to win. The result does not surprise me, he said. I kept my mouth shut during the campaign. I think that's what it said. Yes, I kept my mouth shut during the campaign, but I thought it would come out like this. And then, of quite a lot more. That's the gist of what he says. There's some more behind. Let's have a little comment. Ian?
Yeah, we've just dropped on a problem which I'm sure has occurred to Harold Wilson long since. And that is that out of this very tiny majority, which he's going to face the new House of Commons in 10 days' time, he has immediately going to deduct one in order to create a vacancy for Patrick Gordon Walker. I think Mr. Wilson's made it perfectly clear, as clear as anything apart from saying it in plain words, that he's going to make Patrick Gordon Walker his Foreign Secretary, despite the Smethwick result. He's certainly not going to send him to the House of Lords. This means that he's got to ask some senior Labour backbencher in a safe Labour seat to stand down so that there can be a by-election and Patrick Gordon Walker can go in.
Hello. It's all right, I'm just trying to stop you, Ian, but I wanted to add, in fairness to Mr. Hogg, because once before I quoted briefly from Mr. Hogg, and he got me into the most terrible trouble at the time of the budget, that he did add afterwards that a small majority would be held for everyone in the House of Commons, but he said it can be done. The public interests do not need to suffer.
So this...
I think we can get too tense about this narrow majority thing. I remember in 1950, when there was a majority of 6, everyone said a crash of a taxi on the way to the House could bring the government down. Well, this time, the Labour Party will have the Liberals there. Now, one thing the Liberals plainly can't afford financially or otherwise is to have an election. And so they can't really place a very tough bargain with the Labour Party. If the Labour Party says, well, you can bring us down and bear the odium of bringing us down if you want to, we then think we shall inherit the radical vote. So I do think that the likelihood of an immediate election being forced by a parliamentary accident is not very great, unless the Labour Party absolutely deliberately wanted to force it and make the Liberals identify with the other side. I can't see this. The Liberals have got 3 million votes and are an impressive force, but they simply can't afford an election in the near future. I'm sure that they would do very badly, or be likely to do very badly. People would feel it really was a tense battle between the major parties, and the Liberals were a third.
No, the Liberals need to prop up their position. They need some...
Can I just interrupt you to go to the PA board?
Still hanging on the very cliff for that further result to give the 316 that Labour requires for a clear-cut win. The General Secretary claiming a final overall majority of 4 is probably right.
Now, to return to Ian, whom we interrupted a moment ago.
No, the situation that we shall undoubtedly Labour will have to operate in the new House of Commons is, quite frankly, one which a lot of people would like to see operating anyway, even if there's a perfectly comfortable majority. That the position of the government's continuing to...
Can I just interrupt you a moment to say the Conservatives have held Hexham?
This is one of the 3 results we're still waiting for. There's Kinross and Penistone are the only other 2 results likely to come in. When Penistone comes in, that puts Labour in the lead clearly with 316 seats. But Hexham just tidies up the picture. We're still waiting for 3 Scottish seats later, 4 Scottish seats later on in the afternoon or in the evening, perhaps after we've all gone to bed.
And 1 or 2 of those could still produce a surprise, but it wouldn't really...
Vast, great constituency, one of the biggest in the country, but with very thin population. Conservative candidate Mr. Rupert Spear, solicitor. My telephone rings. Hello.
He was given a score piece of paper.
Sorry, you're joining all in our little private telephone conversations on the air like this. We're just sorting out whether in fact a Hexham result is in. I was handed a piece of paper which said what had happened at Hexham, which I've now lost. It's here somewhere.
There's no doubt the Conservatives have held Hexham. It will come up on the air in a moment.
Yes, the Press Association tape is here announcing the Hexham results. It is, I think, Conservatives hold Hexham. That's what I received.
That's right.
Here's the Press Association giving the actual figures of the result. So there's no doubt about it. Shall we proceed from there, or what shall we do? Here's Lord Attlee leaving Transport House. A quick look at one of the elder statesmen of the Labour Party.
Lord House, he's been here for quite a brief visit. He looked in with... He looked in, as I say, with Harold Wilson, posed briefly on the steps for photographs, and is now leaving again after watching television with the rest of the other party leaders for about an hour or so. One wonders, what are his thoughts about this majority? What are his thoughts about, is it workable or isn't it? And remember that he said earlier in this campaign, I don't want Labour to have too big a majority. That, he says, causes trouble. And I am told that Lord Attlee is in fact on his way to you at Television Centre, and I suppose he'll be there in something like 20 minutes, allowing for London traffic. Lord Attlee driving off. We're waiting for Harold Wilson to drive off. Peter Woon at Transport House.
And we'll be waiting for Lord Attlee to arrive here. Meanwhile, here are the full details of the Hexham result that worried us for a moment. Rupert Spear, the Conservative, there's no change in there of the figures.
A 3.6% swing to Labour in this Northumberland seat. There was an 82% poll, actually an increase. This seat used to be held by the former Speaker, Speaker Clifton Brown, and it is interesting, here is a safe seat, and 82% of people vote. One thing that often puzzles me is the way in which people, even on a wet day, do take the trouble to vote in seats where they can't conceivably have any doubt about the outcome. The vote is down a bit compared to last time, but still, time and again, in safe seats, you get 85% voting, and since there's a certain amount of inaccuracy on the register and people have died and moved away, 90% is the maximum possible. So one may speak about low interest in politics, but with over 75% of the people voting, this isn't a very depressing figure at all.
It is, in fact, the lowest since the war.
No, it's more than in 1945, when there was only 72%, on a very old register, I admit. It is the lowest since the war. It's lower than 55, which was the previous lowest, 76.7, I believe.
I thought the only possible explanation is that this whole election campaign has in effect gone on for at least a year, if not a year and a half, and I think people really are bored with it, or were bored with it.
Well, it's likely to go on for another months, years, we don't know.
On this point that Peter Woon was quoting Lord Attlee as saying that a majority which is too large can be rather difficult. This has certainly been proved conclusively since the war. I think the Conservatives will be the first to admit that whatever Sir Gerald Nabarro was saying earlier on, that their most comfortable time in their 13 years of office was probably when they only had a majority of 17. Certainly their most difficult times when they had a majority of 100 over the last 5 years. I think we're quite simple. It's quite simple. There are an awful lot of backbenchers sculling around with nothing to do.
There's going to be a great deal of tension in this House. There's something psychological about having a very small majority, and there are more people with majorities under 100 in this House than I think in any House of Commons since the war. I've been checking on it. In fact, there's even luck between the parties. There are 3 Conservative-held seats with small majorities, only a majority of 10 in Reading, majority of 11 in Eton and Slough, and reversal from a majority of 88 for Labour last time, and a majority of 14 for Mr Julian Amery in Preston North.
Do you think this is good for them?
I don't know it's good for the people who hold them. I think it makes them extra tense, but it excites the party organisations and means that they do fight an extremely tough fight. I must say in North Preston, the defeated Conservative Labour candidate, Mr Russell Carr, was defeated by 14 after a recount. His wife got in Rochester and Chatham after a less tense recount. She got in by 1,000 votes, but the husband and wife listening to recounts in north and south of England must be a new record. On the Labour side, Labour won Brighton Kemp Town by a majority of 7 and Ealing North by a majority of 27 in those 2 seats that they couldn't resolve last night, and the poor candidates went to bed. If they slept at all, I don't know, on those figures. And then there was Wellingborough, which Labour just won from a 600 majority for the Conservatives last time by a majority of 46 this time.
I would have thought that having a very tiny majority would keep you very much on your toes, knowing that you haven't got all that number of people who love you back in the constituency.
Yes, yet normally there's a swing that is much bigger. I mean, what is a marginal seat this time isn't particularly likely to be a marginal seat next time. Though admittedly, Eton and Slough and Meriden and South West Norfolk stand out against that this time. They've both been successive elections. Hair's breadth majorities. South West Norfolk is the most extreme thing in the country.
What keeps you on your toes is not what's had you back in your constituency, but in this situation, it's your party whips down in Westminster.
Certainly, they whip you.
Who are lashing around. This is when I say now the Labour Party will have to operate a system whereby the fate of the government rests only on a confidence vote.
Right. Robert Mackenzie, anxious to talk up there.
Well, let's take a closer look now at some incidents in the career of the man who will soon be the Prime Minister of Britain, Harold Wilson. At age 8½, one of the most prophetic photographs ever taken in British politics, the young Harold posing in front of number 10. I believe he wrote a schoolboy essay explaining that he wanted to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he did take the opportunity to stand in front of the house next door, namely number 10. Then his marriage, 1940, and in 1947, his appearance as a young cabinet minister. As president of the Board of Trade, at a very early age, 31, he was the youngest cabinet minister since the younger Pitt. One of the remarkable incidents in a wholly remarkable career. Now a more mature man is seen in his office as leader of the House, as leader of the Labour Party in the House of Commons. That's the office round which a great deal of the strategy of this campaign undoubtedly was planned. Here he would meet with his shadow ministers and discuss how to conduct their strategy both in the House and to some extent in the country.
Well, let's take the state of the parties as shown by the Press Association.
Still trembling on the brink, but there's no question whatever that Labour is going to get the necessary 316 and very likely 317.
And now let's go to number 10 Downing Street. I think the Prime Minister is about to emerge.
Door is open. Here comes Sir Alec.
And here Sir Alec comes.
Are you ready
Prime
now to
Minister.
concede defeat to the Queen now? I'm going to see the Queen. Have you conceded defeated? I'm not going to say any more, except I'm going to see the Queen. When do you think the next election will be, Sir Alec? Oh, I can't tell you any more. I'm just going to see Her Majesty. Where do you think this fight has gone wrong, Sir Alec? I got nothing to say, except that I'm now going to see Her Majesty. Where will you be going from that? I think probably no later. And will you be coming back to Downing Street tonight? When will next election be, sir? I don't know.
There, with all of us shouting at him, goes Sir Alec, the Prime Minister, as I hope you heard, to see the Queen. There he goes, driving off down Downing Street for the last time. As I said before, obviously sympathetic crowd, although there is some booing. Sir Alec, I hope you heard that, has gone now to see the Queen. After that, he hopes to go and see Lord Blakeney. More than this, he will not, at the moment, say. This is Michael Barrett in Downing Street.
No doubt he has an appointment, I'd imagine, at 3:30. It takes about 6 minutes to get to Buckingham Palace from where he is now. Ian, now what is the next drill that follows his seeing the Queen?
Sir Alec seeing the Queen, obviously, to hand in resignation of himself and his ministers, and so bring to an end 13 years of Conservative rule. The Queen may ask Sir Alec to advise her who she should send for, but it's perfectly obvious she would then send for Harold Wilson. She would invite him to form an administration. On the figure, he would undoubtedly, I would have thought there was no question that he would accept her mission to form a government. He would then drive back. He would drive back, I thought at once, to Downing Street to set up office there. It doesn't necessarily mean he'll move into Downing Street as a house for a day or two, give the Douglas Humes time to move out, but he will drive in to take charge of the Cabinet Office in Downing Street. He will begin then, of course, at once to form his administration. He will get in touch with his senior colleagues. Difficult to say. I didn't hear Robin Day's conversation with him on the train earlier today. I believe he didn't give any indication of when he might be giving his first list of ministers. On past form, I would have thought it was unlikely we'd get a list tonight, but probably over the weekend we would get certainly the first list of the senior ministers, who's going to be Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, the new job of Minister of Economic Affairs, which is expected to go to George Brown. We get this, we might get the whole cabinet. But altogether, Mr. Wilson will have something like 70 or 80 government posts to fill. This includes the various whips offices in both houses of Parliament, don't forget. He also has to make various appointments in the House of Lords. And this process will take him probably to the middle of next week. The new Parliament, the new House of Commons, meets on Tuesday week. The first thing they do will be to elect the Speaker,
We'll go to Buckingham Palace. The Prime Minister is on his way, arriving there in a moment. We join Alan Wicker.
Alan Wicker at Buckingham Palace. Through pale sunlight, Sir Alec, in his last few minutes as Prime Minister, drives up the Mall towards Buckingham Palace to present his resignation to the Queen, to hand in his seals. There he goes, through the South Centre gate. And when he drives away, he'll no longer be Prime Minister, no longer First Lord of the Treasury, but leader of Her Majesty's opposition, leader of the Conservative Party. Though, of course, no one knows whether he'll remain leader of the Conservatives or whether in the post-mortem, in the party inquest to come, he may be replaced by a new leader. Alan Wicker, Buckingham Palace.
So the Prime Minister arrives at the palace. I expect he's gone down to the first floor on the right-hand side, overlooking Constitution Hill, where the Queen has her study and her drawing room, and there, I imagine, in the semi-private apartments, he will hand over his seals of office, which is probably a metaphor, this exact moment, he probably is not handing over a box. That may be sent, but technically he does so and takes farewell of the sovereign. Now, Bob.
Well, the longest period of one-party rule in modern British history is now coming to an end. The 13 years of Conservative rule coming to an end at this very moment, as the Prime Minister is about to turn over the seals of office. There's no question at all that Labour will form a government. This will be the 5th government the Labour Party has formed, but curiously enough, only one of the 5 began its work with a working majority in the House. 4 times now, Labour has taken office without a clear, comfortable working majority. Only once, that is 1945, did Labour have a working majority when it took office. One of the tasks of the new government will be to be seen to rule, to set up a style in order to give momentum to its new position. Undoubtedly, no one will want an immediate general election. Therefore, we're all agreed, I think, that there is every reason to expect that Labour will have a run for a given period. It might be as long as it was in 50, around 18 months, might be longer. And the style of the government as it takes over will be all important. At the same time, it will face very serious difficulties and major decisions in the days immediately ahead. How to deal with the balance of payments crisis, what to do about the mixed-manned MLF, which America is pushing on Europe, and all these things will crowd in on a government with a tiny majority, almost all, 3/4 of its members new to office, trying to learn the ropes, and we're in for an extremely tricky and delicate period of British politics, it's perfectly clear.
Now, we better have a quick look at the PA state of the parties, shall we, the Press Association Board?
Labour hasn't got its 316, but presumably Sir Alex's view is that with 315, it is impossible for him now to get a majority either, and in that sense, it is clear that although Labour hasn't got its 316, he cannot possibly himself have a majority. Anything that happens from now on, he could only end up even Steven with Labour at 315, and of course that's not going to happen, so he's acting on the results of 315. I don't think he knows yet, as we don't, when the 316 is coming. But he is acting clearly on the assumption that his majority is now gone and seen and proved to be gone by the fact that Labour has exactly half the seats in the House of Commons.
Now, up on the top shelf in the studio, Kenneth Alsop is waiting. We go over to him.
I have with me 3 industrialists. Mr. Donald Stokes of Leyland, Sir Joseph Lockwood of EMI, Sir William McFadden of British Calendar Cables. Now, gentlemen, what's the reaction of industrialists in general to this very narrow Labour majority? Sir Joseph.
Well, I'm not too disappointed. I think it'll be a jolly good thing to have a good shake-out of the ministers. I think Mr. Wilson will be unable to carry through a lot of the things I don't think he should do, which I don't agree with. He will have a period of discipline where he'll have to behave himself, and I hope he'll be able to carry through some of the good things which I do approve of, with the support of the other parties during his training period for himself and his ministers.
Mr. Stokes, do you think the shake-up is a good idea?
Well, I certainly think it's a good idea. We need a change, and I think that industry goes on despite politicians, not because of them. But there are a lot of points in the Labour Party's programme which, if they carry them out, and if they use a little caution in preparing for them, and if they take advice and don't just trust to a lot of theoreticians, might be very much to the benefit of industry as a whole.
Sir William, do you agree with this very liberal attitude of industrialists?
Very largely. I think there's a lot of comfort in that there is not an overwhelming majority, and that some of the measures that industry does disagree with very, very strongly cannot be carried out. I think the wish of British industry is that all parties will now get together and tackle the really urgent problems that have got to be tackled.
Well, in fact, of course, there are very urgent problems, and whichever Prime Minister it is going to face a very grim financial situation by the looks of things. What measures would you like to see him take first of all?
Well, I think first there's several very important ones. One is that we've got to have wage policy right across the board, not only wages, salaries and incomes and dividends right across the board. I also think that we've got to improve on our export performance. I think he's got to consult with people who are actually exporting at the moment, and I strongly believe that we've got to give some incentive to people to export. It's very unfair. Half the community should be, half of industry should be putting all this effort into export, and the other half living on the fat of the land, sitting on their behinds at home.
Would you add to that, Sir Joseph?
I think the most important thing that has to be tackled, though not the most immediate, is to increase the productivity of labour, to find ways of doing work with less people. Now, this has been talked of very vaguely, in vague terms, by different parties. They talk about restrictive practices and so on. Mr. Wilson says that we're reluctant to modernize in industry. In fact, there's no resistance to change, there's no money problem. The real problem is the attitude of the Labour Party and the trade unions to modernization. And the first thing they should do is to come out quite openly with a statement that they intend to change this attitude, that we must make redundancy a respectable thing. Of course, you must treat people properly in unemployment and training for change. But there's a tremendous labour shortage and likely to be for years.
Do you bat the ball back quite so firm to the Labour Party and say they're to blame for lack of modernisation, and the unions, of course?
I do, largely. I think that the removal of all restrictive practices must be followed by every party, because we must get our productivity up and our costs down. And then the second battle, of course, or an equal battle, is exports, and that is going to be greatly influenced by our productivity and by our cost. As regards incentives and exports, I think we've got to approach this export problem now with an absolutely open mind and reconsider everything to see what we can do. But I do plead one thing, that we do keep exports in perspective, because they're not too bad, but they're not good enough, and we've just got to boost them up further and further.
Do you think that now Mr. Wilson, with his tiny majority, will try to push through his more controversial measures, such as steel nationalisation, capital gains tax?
I think it would be very wrong for him to do so. If you take the Liberal vote, which is anti-steel nationalisation, add it to the Conservative, there's 55% of voting, I think, against nationalisation, and I think we're absolutely wrong. I don't think he could do anyway. I don't think he could force it through with a small majority.
Well, it would be a great pity if he tried, because there are so many more urgent things than that. I mean, steel nationalisation is really a domestic issue. Steel industry is doing quite well at the moment. Let's get the energy and the drive that we hope the Labour Party will possess into doing something more positive that's going to bring better rewards to all of us in this country, and I'm sure industry will support him in this.
Gentlemen, you all seem rather benign towards Mr. Wilson and his new government, if there is one. Would you feel quite the same way if he had a spanking majority of, say, 50?
I think we'll give any new boy a chance. That's what it is.
Yes.
We'll give him a chance to get on with the job, and I'm sure that industry will support the government in power and do their best to make a success of this country. That's what we all want to do, all of us. We've all got one thing in common, and that's the prosperity and well-being of this nation.
Would you feel quite so kindly towards him, Sir Joseph?
If he had a majority of 50, no. But I feel very kindly to him, providing we don't let him do some of the silly things which he said, which I don't think he really believed in, personally. But I do think that he should tackle this balance of payments thing, and this I agree. He said that he believes in controlling imports. We get exhortation to export day after day after day for 30 years. And what about imports? We're buying with dollars. We haven't got American blueberry pies, kangaroo tail soup, big American cars, and all this sort of thing. And it's about time we clamped on imports on luxuries. They could save...
Are they luxuries, kangaroo tail soup?
Well, I should have thought so, when you haven't got the money to pay for them.
Well, I don't totally agree with you.
Well, I would prefer...
I
would prefer free trade. It's £250 million of imports could be saved by cutting down on luxury imports as a temporary measure. Once we balance our payments, I'm all for complete free trade.
It's rather surprising to hear this austerity
But you try and export to the world, you have difficulties almost everywhere. There is not free trade in this world.
Do you agree with this point of view, Sir William?
There have to be a temporary restriction of luxury imports, but fundamentally it is wrong, because the greatest benefit to Britain must flow from the most full and free flow of world trade. As regards being benign, don't misunderstand me, I'm not benign. I'm relieved that they have got a small majority, and I hope that, and I back up what Donald said, that we should all go.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Going straight down to Transport House, I think Mr. Wilson is about to depart to the Palace. Transport House.
Shut the door. Shut the door. We're sure we're on the right door, aren't we, Derek? Let me still know. Is he definitely coming this way?
You may have heard a little conversation about are we in the right door. This is the BBC having quiet conversations. I think we've lost Peter Woon at the moment, who doesn't know we're on the doorway. What we are in fact doing is waiting at Transport House. Peter Woon standing in the doorway, waiting at Transport House to see Mr. Wilson's departure we presume, to Buckingham Palace, where he will have been summoned by Her Majesty the Queen. Let's try once again and see if we can communicate with Peter Wood. No, well, evidently at the moment we can't. Never mind, we shall certainly recognize Mr. Wilson when he leaves. It shouldn't be very difficult at the moment. Quite a sizable crowd outside. Now, Peter Wood's now ready for us. OK, Peter, we're coming to you. Over we come.
We're waiting for the next Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson. Meanwhile, from Transport House, Peter Wood.
That's about the shortest outside broadcast we've done for years. It's one of those where you say hello and goodbye. Never mind. Now, here's an interesting thing. There's been some very lively reaction in Europe to what has been going on today. And I think it might be worthwhile now seeing an interview done just now between Michael Charlton and a banker in Switzerland, Dr. Schaefer. This is what they had to say about our election.
On Eurovision, the British election is being watched closely all over Europe, and nowhere more closely than in Zurich, where I'm about to talk to a Swiss banker, chairman of the board of the Union Bank of Switzerland, Dr. Alfred Schaefer. Dr. Schaefer, well, how much interest have you been taking personally in this election?
Well, we followed very closely in all these last weeks the speeches, and we're very interested about the outcome.
You've noticed, I have no doubt, the new British trade gap figures published this morning, which have gone up to £111 million. Does this concern you in Zurich?
Well, it happened very often in the past, and every English government took the necessary drastic measures to correct the situation. Therefore, we expect that they will be corrected too by the new government.
Now, this new government looks like having a very, very small majority indeed. What's your reaction to that?
Well, in a way, we are sorry about it. We had naturally to take into consideration the possibility of a victory for either side. Both parties were in a position to win, and it was up to us to weigh these two possibilities and their consequences. But as England always were a little bit the leader of the small nations in Europe, we hoped that in any case England would have a strong majority so that it could exercise its enormous influence on the continent and in the world.
Well, therefore, you are disappointed that it doesn't look as if you're getting the clear-cut and firm decision that you were looking for.
Yes, because we, especially as bankers and as Swiss, we are always putting security and stability and a clear situation above other considerations.
How serious do you feel the economic problem that Britain faces is?
I think it's certainly serious, but the Britons were always up to it, and also in the past you had these situations. We are therefore convinced that a new Labour government will respect the existing institutions and principles which have established London in the past 10 years, again as the leader of the financial world.
What do you mean by the existing institutions?
Well, especially the tradition of the City of London, the outstanding policies of the Bank of England, the very liberal policies and the flexible money and capital markets. We are therefore sure that every English government is aware of the importance of the excellent reputation England has always enjoyed because of this attitude to foreign money and to worldwide transactions.
Just a final question, Dr. Schaefer. Do you feel that this rather feeble majority, as it looks at the moment, although we're not quite sure what the final result will be yet, this rather feeble majority will only prolong the uncertainty about Britain's place in Europe, indeed in the world?
It could be. It's already a little bit a political question. I can only tell you that the markets do not expect any drastic changes. Perhaps the steel industry could be affected. But politically, it certainly would have been better to have either way a strong government.
Thank you, Dr. Alfred Schaefer in Zurich.
Well, there's the European view. Now let's take the Press Association's State of the Party board again.
Still no 316. But it's only a matter of time, and quite inevitable, of course, and quite clearly the Prime Minister decided to act once Labour had 315 because it ruled out the possibility of any other combination being able to acquire 316 and try to carry on. So he therefore went to the palace and we no doubt the transaction between the Prime Minister and monarch has progressed, and we understand that Harold Wilson is now on his way to the palace.
Meanwhile, we'll keep our eye on things outside, but meanwhile, Michael Foot, who was successful in an hour in Bevan's old seat at Ebbw Vale, is waiting to talk to Robin Day.
Good afternoon, Mr. Foot. We may be interrupted by an event which you will know about when Mr. Wilson gets to the palace, but how do you see things yourself? What's your reaction to this extraordinary political situation?
Well, I'm extremely glad to see Sir Alec Douglas-Hume leaving Downing Street, and I'm even more pleased to see Harold Wilson going to Buckingham Palace. I think the air is generally cleaner.
Do you expect a job under Mr. Harold Wilson?
No, I don't expect one at all. But I'm very pleased with the result. And I think people have got sometimes the wrong idea about it. The idea that you can't govern with a small majority is incorrect, you know. And the idea that you can't put through big measures with a small majority is untrue. As far as I recall, I haven't looked it up, I think the Great Reform Bill was carried by only one vote. So we maybe could carry a steel nationalisation with a small majority. And these businessmen who've just been on this television, apparently their idea is that everything will be all right now if Harold Wilson follows the policies of the Conservative Party which have been defeated. Of course, that's not what's going to happen. And a Labour government in power, with all the machinery of government, great advantage on its side. For one thing, we'll be able to publish all these figures and facts about the economy which the Tories have been suppressing throughout the election. Government in power has a great advantage. The election date for the next election will be picked by a Labour Prime Minister, not by Sir Alec Douglas-Hume waiting to the very last moment. So people don't appreciate yet the full big change that has taken place and the great advantage which has swung to the Labour Party. Of course, we would have liked to have had an even bigger majority, and we are deeply sad at the defeat of people like Fenner Brockway. This is a tragedy of the first order. But apart from such things as that, I think the Labour Party has got every right to be rejoiced, and every right, if we do it boldly enough, to face the future with great confidence and the possibility that in a measurable time we will go to the electorate at a time of our own choosing and get the substantial majority which, of course, many of us had hoped to have on this occasion.
If you could spare me a moment, Mr. Foot, do you think that if you were offered a job, you would refuse one?
Well, it depends what it was, but that's a very trivial matter. The most important thing is that Labour government.
I've got your point there about the Labour government's a good thing. But what I'm interested in, if you were in the government, there'd probably be three brothers, feet, in the government. You, Dingle, and possibly Sir Hugh.
I think that the other two are much more likely to get jobs than I am, although my opinion on the competence, of course, might not be the same.
But you don't think you'll make a good minister? You think you're too rebellious? Too wild?
Why, the personal matters are of no importance whatsoever. What is important, what is sad, of course, is that in many tremendous fights have been put up by Labour candidates throughout the country. I think of my own old constituency of Plymouth, where people have fought so well and only just missed. Personal matters don't matter.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Foot. Right? I'd like to go on to something else, but we can't.
Because it is just announced officially that Her Majesty the Queen has accepted the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume's resignation. This, in fact, means at this very moment that there are no less than 5 living former Prime Ministers of this country. Sir Winston Churchill, Lord Attlee, Lord Avon, Mr. Macmillan, and now Sir Alec Douglas-Hume. And David Butler says that's more than they've ever been since 1927. We are, I believe, quite soon going to see or hear, rather ironically, the result of the Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister's own constituency, Kinross and West Perth, from the Highlands. For the moment, we will wait until I see where we can go next. I think the best thing is to ask Ian temporarily for a little speculation and comment.
All right, at the moment, of course, we have no government. We have no Prime Minister. The former Prime Minister has handed his resignation. Mr. Wilson is now, we gather, on his way to the palace. But Mr. Wilson will then be invited to form a government. He will then do so, and the business of the exchange will carry on. As I was saying earlier, this will take altogether probably upwards of a week. One important problem facing Mr. Wilson, he now has less than 3 weeks to prepare the Queen's speech, which will open the new session of Parliament, which will set out the programme of the new government. Robert Mackenzie has mentioned some of the problems he will have to deal with, like going to Washington, the MLF, great change in Russia. But one wonders what's going to happen to the conception of the 100 days, the things that he doesn't have to do but he would like to do. He's promised early action on pensions. This presumably he can certainly get through with the support of the Liberals, even without them.
We're going straight over to the declaration of Kinross and West Perth, the ex-Prime Minister's seat, over to the Highlands, to Perth.
It may be certain that Sir Alec isn't our next Prime Minister, but I don't think there's much doubt he'll be the member for Kinross and West Perthshire. He's more than 9,000 votes ahead the last time, and there's no evidence of a swing against him. Here they come now, the returning officer, Sheriff Emsley, to give us the result.
As returning officer for the constituency of Kinross and West Perthshire, I have to tell you that the total number of votes cast for each candidate is as follows. Arthur Donaldson, 3,522.
Scottish nationalist.
Sir Alexander Frederick Douglas Hume, 16,659. Andrew Forrester, 4,687. Christopher
Labour.
Murray Grieve, 127. I therefore declare that Sir Alexander Frederick Douglas Hume is duly elected to serve in Parliament as member for this constituency.
As Labour candidate...
And at this very moment that his constituency result is announced, we expect at any moment to see him arriving back at Downing Street. David, quickly.
Well, that suggests no swing in Kinross compared to the last election, and an increase in the Prime Minister's majority compared to the by-election in November last year. The communist who was going to make a petition on the grounds of television only got 127 votes. That's the fewest votes that any candidate, I think, has got in any constituency in this election, although he's a very distinguished poet, Hugh McDermott.
I said that Sir Alec Douglas Hume was on his way back to Downing Street. I think not. In fact, my information is he's gone off, as I think we said earlier, to see Lord Blakenham. Just read you the official palace statement. It's still only about 3 or 4 minutes old. Right Honourable Sir Alexander Douglas Hume had an audience of the Queen this afternoon and tendered his resignation as Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, which Her Majesty was graciously pleased to accept. Ian?
I'm just going to say, I think we should take some note of this as a historic moment that we've, after one party being in office for 13 years, you've now got this tremendous change, and I thought the point that Michael Foot made was very fair, that this is a great change, the changing of the guard.
We saw Lord Aptley leaving Transport House a few minutes ago. He has now arrived in the studio. Here he is, and he's sitting with Robin Day.
Of course, Lord Aptley is one of the 5 living British Prime Ministers. We're very grateful to you for coming along this afternoon. First of all, could you give us your assessment from your experience as Prime Minister when there was only a majority of 5 or 6, how Mr. Wilson is going to cope with this situation?
Well, he's probably got a younger party than I had, which will help, because the tactics were to try and wear us down for our old men. So that's one difference. The second thing is, it's very difficult to say just how a House of Commons will behave. Every house has its own particular character. It may be fractious, may be cooperative. One can't quite be sure how it's going to behave.
Do you think Mr. Wilson is likely to have trouble with the so-called left wing of the Labour Party, or do you think they're likely to keep themselves in check?
I don't think he'll have trouble, no.
What advice do you give to Mr. Wilson?
My advice is go right ahead on your programme.
Would you care to give your assessment of Mr. Wilson as a political figure, his qualities and his characteristics, as you know them?
Well, of course, he's extremely well qualified intellectually. A good economist, good historian, that's a great advantage. He's a very good debater, and I think he's got good, sound judgment.
From your experience, Lord Aptley, is the Queen likely to give any suggestions on the choice of ministers?
I don't think so. I don't think so. George VI,
wasn't there some question of who should be Foreign Secretary in 1945?
Oh, he just expressed an opinion, but I wasn't really pressed at all.
Wasn't it going to be Mr. Dalton before lunch, and then it was Ernest Bevin after lunch?
Yes, that had nothing to do with seeing the King. No.
How soon do you think, if Mr. Wilson goes to the palace about now, how soon do you think he will submit the first list of ministers to Her Majesty?
I think tomorrow, probably.
How big a cabinet do you think there should be? There's about 23 at the moment. Do you think that's too big?
Much too big.
How many should there be?
16 or 17.
I believe Mr. Wilson favours a smaller cabinet.
Yeah.
One final question, Lord Attlee. Cynical people say that it's the civil servants who run the country and the politicians talk, but in essence it's the unknown or unseen civil servants who really take the decisions. What do you say about that?
Depends on the ministers. If your ministers have any strength of character, they run it. If they're weak, they accept what the civil servant says.
Lord Attlee, thank you very much for coming along.
After that interview with Lord Attlee, we can take the full details of the result to Kinross and West Perthshire. Sir Alec Douglas Hume's seat. The result coming in almost immediately after he left the palace, having resigned.
His majority goes up about 3,000 there. There's a 1% swing, 2% swing compared to the 1959 election to Labour, but it is the safest Conservative seat in Scotland, and I'm sure that Sir Alec is pleased with his majority there.
I should tell you that we are still waiting for Mr. Wilson to leave Transport House to receive the Queen's summons. Normally, I think it's a practice for the Queen not to summons the new man until the first man has gone. It's a little matter of delicatesse. Sir Alec has arrived at the Conservative Central Office. He has gone to see Lord Blakeland. Let's take the Press Association State of the Parties Board.
Here we are, still Labour with its 315, and the final result to ensure their 316 is not yet with us, but of course everybody has agreed it's simply a matter of time. We don't know when it will be. It could drag on a little while longer yet. From our figures, it seems very likely, I think, that the claim made by the General Secretary of the Labour Party, Mr. Len Williams, that they would have a majority of 4 seems highly probable. This is a very likely situation. And I think we also have agreed on what's been coming in, that there's every reason to think that a government will be formed, that it will act effectively in an attempt immediately to establish a style and to impress the country with its effectiveness in facing the matters that lie immediately ahead. But this is, of course, for the moment, over the horizon. But we're now at the verge of the formation of a new government.
We're also waiting for events on this verge. The outward sign that the government is about to be formed. Mr. Wilson, who no doubt knows what he's going to do in his mind by now, has known for a long time.
His immediate problem, I thought, was pinpointed by what Lord Attlee said. Lord Attlee advised him very bravely to go straight ahead with his programme. If he does this, then what is he going to put in the Queen's speech? Is he going to put in the repeal of the Rent Act? Is he going to put in the nationalisation of urban land and the renationalisation of steel? With respect to Mr. Michael Foot, this is an awful lot to put through one session of Parliament with a majority of 4.
David? I think that the Prime Minister, if Mr. Wilson becomes Prime Minister, he could, of course, ask for time. After all, the Prime Minister who just resigned, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, did take to himself an extra 2 weeks, 3 weeks while he had a by-election after he became Prime Minister. And in this delicate situation, the Labour Party has got to feel itself anew into a situation it hadn't really envisaged. It could ask for a little extra time. I don't think it will. But it certainly, nobody could complain if it did.
Yes, I don't think this is his problem. I mean, he's got a whole list of things that he'd like to put in the Queen's speech. I think his problem now is how much he can afford to put in with this small majority.
Yes, well, he has got, of course, he has 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and he certainly will be given a reasonably easy passage, I would have thought, by the other side, by the Liberals and by the Conservatives. So. Nobody would sympathise with him being harried right from the beginning, with the Labour government being harried. They must be given a fair innings. I'm sure that would be the instinct of all their opponents, however bitter their opponents are.
Oh, yes. There will be what is known as a honeymoon period, I'm quite sure, up until Christmas.
How long does the honeymoon last?
Well, this is a good point. It depends, very much depends on I would have thought, quite honestly, on Harold Wilson's own personal approach to the new House of Commons as Prime Minister.
I think he is a person who has visibly changed a great deal in the last 2 years, and that is without being Prime Minister, just being treated as a potential future Prime Minister. I presume that he will change still more. We just can't tell what sort of a man will be in the ultimate office, the highest office in any country, until he exercises it. We didn't know, and this is very relevant to Russia, we don't know whether Brezhnev will be impressive in Russia or not until he's exercised the power. You can envisage it and envisage it, but you never know until you actually are exercising the office whether you're good at it. You make good guesses, but you can't be certain. And a man will learn and develop his style of exercising his office once he's there. And we may see a quite unexpected Harold Wilson in the next few months, for good or for ill.
Yes, and the crucial point in this present situation with the narrow majority in the House of Commons is how he deals with the House of Commons. And this is something which people who haven't seen him in the House of Commons cannot conceive. He is even his opponents recognise he is a master of the House of Commons. He is a superb debater. He's brilliant at question time. And if he manages to keep this, at the same time shows a certain what's the word, magnanimity, I think. This is the one thing he needs to show.
One of the things he did last night was, on the whole, I think, to be very statesmanlike and show very considerable magnanimity. He didn't make any premature claims at a time when it really looked as though Labour was going to win with a perfectly adequate majority.
The national share of the vote. Mr. Wilson officially has been summoned to the palace, by the way. Just come in, it's a rush. The national share of the vote, Bob Mackenzie. We may have to interrupt you, Bob.
Here's the picture then nationally, just rounded off to the nearest half, showing the Labour position slightly ahead of the Tories. Labour is actually just under 45, and that's the balance nationally. Now let's see where Labour has done best, where Tories have done best in various parts of the country, and also where the Liberals have made their best showing. You can compare the national here with the home counties position, for example, where the Tories ran slightly ahead of their position nationally, and Labour ran a little behind them.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're going to Transport House.
And here he comes, Mr. Harold Wilson, waiting on the steps now with Mr. George Brown beside him and Mrs. Wilson, dressed as you see to go and see the Queen. Mr. Harold Wilson going through now on his way to the Queen and Buckingham Palace. Man has been facing a period of as intense strain as any politician has ever had, I would say, in the last hour or so. He leaves behind him some very worried and long faces in the committee room where the Labour Party leaders are meeting, and at the same time great cheeriness among ordinary party workers because they know they're going to get in. Britain's 1964 Prime Minister going to accept office facing a political task as tough, one would think, as any Prime Minister in our long history, and being cheered on his way from his political headquarters. If the car can get through the crush. Incidentally, Sir Alec Douglas-Home passed right by this office just now, and he got some rather loud boos and cries of "Ex-Hume, ex-Hume." Right, it's for Alan Wicker to find that car and pick it up at Buckingham Palace. Peter Woon from Transport House.
Robin Day, come in.
And while Mr. Wilson goes to the palace, I would like to talk to two distinguished newspaper editors, one in the north and the other in the west. First of all, one in the west, one in Newcastle on Tyne, the editor of the Northern Echo, Mr. Evans. Can
Hello.
you hear? Can you
Hello.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good.
Robin.
And may I connect up also with Mr. Price of the Western Daily Press in Bristol? No. Well, Mr. Evans of the Northern Echo. Could you tell me a little bit about how things have gone in your part of the country? As I understand it, the prime factor is that the swing against the Conservatives there was higher than anywhere else. That is so, isn't it?
Yes, it's more than 4%. I work it out about 4.5, which is more than the national average. Mind you, it's been terribly, terribly erratic between different parts of this region. Darlington, for instance, has swung by 6.5% to Labour, but a seat in Newcastle has changed hands with only 0.1% swing to Labour. So it's wrong to speak of a regional swing as such. It's very different within the region.
Because I'm getting a little bit bored with talk of swing now. Could we, what were the issues there with unemployment, development?
Well, very much so. The winter of our discontent, unemployment in the northeast here last winter was very bad, and that hurt the Conservatives. The Hailsham plan helped, but the Conservative campaign didn't help by saying that everything was fine because people up here had short memories, and they remembered the very short time ago when they were out of work. Railway cuts, Dr. Beeching, a great deal of anti-Hume feeling in the north. We took some opinion polls which showed that the working people, the working man up here, was highly critical of Sir Alexander Douglas Shue, much more so than our opinion polls in the South.
Could I come in for just a moment and connect up with your colleague in Bristol of the Western Daily Press, Mr. Price? Can you hear me?
Yes.
And how would you sum up the situation in the West Country?
There have been no startling changes in the West Country at all, with the exception of Torrington. That's out of our area. I'm thinking of Bristol. In Bristol we have an issue which is peculiar to us, but which may become national with the advent of a Labour government, and that is the takeover of schools, the absorption of grammar schools into a comprehensive system. This has caused a tremendous amount of furore in Bristol, and I'm quite certain it's cost the Labour Party a great many votes.
Would you describe the Callaghan-Dexter contest in your area?
No.
No. All right. I wasn't sure how much of the West was your empire.
No, we don't go down below Taunton and Minehead and Cheltenham and Gloucester in the north.
Was it a lively campaign in your part of the world, or was it dull? Were people bored, or what?
Oh, I think it got extremely lively over the schools issue, and I'm glad to say that I've been reported at the Press Council over it by Mr. Wilson's aide, Mr. Wedgwood Ben.
Oh, what did you do?
Oh, well, he didn't like our interpretation of Mr. Wilson's speech, which I thought was excessively vague.
And you've been reported to the Press Council for that, have you?
Twice, yes. And once Mr. Ben tape recorded one of our reporters, so we've had quite a lively time down here.
Could you remind us of the politics of your paper?
Well, you know, we were founded as a Liberal paper in the days of the Whigs and Tories. I would like to think that we're independent now, but we wouldn't mind seeing the Whigs and Tories again, you know.
Well, I think we don't know what the swing would be between Whigs and Tories now. But would you like to say, well, who you endorsed for the election? Who did you support?
We didn't support anybody.
You sat on the fence, did you?
No, we didn't do that. We're trying to be an impartial newspaper. My own feelings about the election, I'll be perfectly frank, is that I'm very pleased to see the Labour Party getting in with a small majority, which I hope will shake up the Conservatives, and I would also like to see many more Liberal MPs in Parliament.
Most people seem to think, Mr. Price, that a small Labour majority is bad for the national interest because it may prevent effective, confident government.
Well, I don't...
Mr. George Brown wouldn't agree with that.
No, I'm afraid I don't subscribe to it.
Could I come back to Mr. Price in Newcastle? What are the politics of your paper? Mr. Evans, I'm sorry.
We're an old-established radical Liberal paper. We did take very similar lines from Mr. Price. We advised people that the Liberal vote wasn't a wasted vote. We said it was time for change, and we're not too unhappy, but we are an independent paper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans in Newcastle.
We are interrupting to go straight to Buckingham Palace where Mr. Wilson's arriving.
They're changing the guard at Buckingham Palace, and there's the captain of the new guard. The Queen has called Mr. Harold Wilson, who commands a majority support in the House of Commons. He arrives with Mrs. Wilson at the South Centre Gate. As I understand it, here on the ground, if it's clear that he can form a government, he will kiss hands and leave the palace as Prime Minister, though this appointment has to be confirmed by the new Labour MPs who've not yet elected him their leader. If there's any doubt at all whether he can form a government, he does not kiss hands and will leave the palace not as Prime Minister, but still as Prime Minister designate. Sir Alec, the former Prime Minister, spent 20 minutes in audience with the Queen. This is Alan Wicker at Buckingham Palace.
According to this piece of paper, here's the 316th Labour seat at Penistone.
Labour has 316 seats. Labour is in quite beyond any peradventure of a doubt, and they'll probably get one more seat, Western Isles, which is a fairly safe Labour seat on all past records.
Labour then has a majority of at least 4 over all other parties. If you can't discount the Speaker, 5. They have to find a chairman of Ways and Means, it's 4, but they have a majority of 4 or 5 over all other parties.
It may be apposite to say very quickly here that Sir Alec has just said it's been a very close finish. Of course, we'll do our best when we come to meet Parliament to uphold the interests of the nation. Asked about the Conservative leadership, Sir Alec said, I'm the leader of the party, so I shall lead in opposition. Excuse me one moment, I have a telephone call.
And there is the result of this election, which we've had to wait on
Hello, yes.
so long. Result we've had to wait for so long, the closest result since
I just interrupt the programme briefly, ladies and gentlemen, not to startle you too much, to tell you that I've just been told that China has exploded an atomic bomb. Everything's happening today, isn't it? Now, where are we? What with the bombs, Does Sir Alec expect another election soon? He says, I've hardly heard my own result yet. Give me a chance. We are hoping, in fact, to meet Sir Alec Douglas Hume, who I can see in the distance smiling very broadly. Here is the 316th seat, Penistone. No change, and there are the exact figures.
Safe Labour seat in Yorkshire that we've been waiting for a long time. Every seat from England is now in. We're only waiting for 6 seats from the Highlands of Scotland. A 5.2% swing to Labour in Penistone. A Liberal fighting for the first time, getting 16% of the vote.
Just to get to Alec's position, so Alec is of course still leader of the Conservative Party. He now becomes leader of the opposition. He was elected leader of the party. This doesn't change the situation. And he now forms his own shadow cabinet. If he wishes to, he picks his own people. You know, in the Labour Party they have a parliamentary committee which is elected. They don't do this in the Conservative Party. So Alec is elected leader. He picks the shadow cabinet, the men around him that he wants. This is what Sir Winston did immediately after the war. The other decisive body in the Conservative Party, of course, is the 1922 Committee, and now all members of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons become this. All the members of the now retiring government become members of the 1922 Committee.
I think it's worth stressing once again the historic nature of this moment. It's very rare in this country that a party comes to power which has not been in office in the recent past. In 1906 the Liberals came in after 11 years out of office. In 1924 the Labour Party came in never having held power before. And these really are the only major changes. Otherwise it's always been the Conservatives in for longish periods, wartime coalition, giving people experience of holding office. Now we have a relatively inexperienced thing, a team of ministers taking over. There are some survivors from the 45 government, but after 13 years you have a general post in London. This is only really the third time in this century it's happened in this dramatic and complete way, though of course the narrowness of the majority makes one wonder if it's quite as fundamental as the switch around that took place in 1906 at least.
Well, now, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, as you know, has only just left the palace and said farewell to Her Majesty. And in just a few seconds, we should be going to the Conservative Central Office, just after his resignation, while Derek Hart is putting questions there for us to the former Prime Minister to hear from Sir Alec Douglas Hume. Somebody hasn't told our speakers to start. They're banging him on the back. They'll get the message in a moment. I think, in fact, we are waiting, in fact, for the other television network to join us. This is by arrangement. It's an official arrangement. It's a joint interview. Derek Hart is our commentator.
Speculated during the course of today on your feelings and whether you felt you were going to win. Would you like to tell us what your feelings are?
Well, I'm naturally disappointed at not having won. But I think we fought a very hard fight, and the choice of the electors went the way it has done, so I have no complaints, of course. This has been a fairly fought election.
Did you expect to win?
I thought we had a very good chance of winning, but as I say, this is a leader of a party in the middle of an election fight, I think, must feel he's going to win, and on the whole, I thought we had a good chance of pulling it off.
In the light of your experience of the last 3 weeks, Alec, would you have conducted the campaign differently if you were to start over again now?
I don't think I would. I can't see anything that I really would have done differently, I think. I think it was right to go out into the country and all over the country as far as I could, and not stay in London.
You reject any criticism of your not staying in London?
Yes, I think I do. I was here for 3 or 4 times, which seemed to me enough.
Sir Alec, you concentrated very heavily on 2 issues, prosperity and the nuclear deterrent. Would you, with hindsight, have concentrated on other issues instead of those?
I don't think so. I think that those were the 2 main issues. I won't repeat them because I've said it so often in the last fortnight or 3 weeks, but I still think that those are the 2 great issues for this country. And it remains to be seen whether we can, under a socialist government, keep our prosperity rising year by year. And also, I'm quite convinced that the people will understand more and more the importance of the nuclear deterrent.
Mr. Alec, we've heard just a very few minutes ago that China has now exploded an atomic bomb. Do you think had they done this a few days ago, it would have affected fundamentally the outcome of the campaign?
Well, we expected this, of course, and I think it was made public that we expected this, and Mr. Rusk had talked about it too. But I think perhaps the impact of an explosion, actual explosion of the bomb, would have made people think a bit more about the deterrent than they did.
Did you also expect the news that Mr. Khrushchev was to be deposed?
No, I didn't expect that he would be deposed. One didn't know how much longer his political life would last, but it looked like lasting a year or two, because I think his health was reasonably good. But of course he has been deposed, that's the right word.
With your experience in foreign affairs and knowledge of Mr. Khrushchev, what effect do you think this will have on world affairs?
Well, I can't tell. It depends how far the successor to Mr. Khrushchev really alters the emphasis on the Russian defense program. It may be that he thinks that they think that Mr. Khrushchev paid too little attention to investment in defense, particularly in relation to the American lead and particularly in relation perhaps to China, although possibly they were worried about his policy and the effect that it had in dividing China from the Soviet Union. But I think it's too early to assess this.
Coming back to domestic situations, Alec, and the composition of the new House of Commons, what will your tactics be in this new House with this rather curious constitution?
Well, I think quite clearly we must judge everything that's brought forward by the new government on how it affects the interest of the country, and that we shall do. We shall play a constructive part as an opposition.
But would you harry the socialist government?
If they deserve it, of course. But it depends on what they bring forward.
You don't anticipate...
It remains to be seen how far I think they bring forward their program in light of the majority that they've done.
And you don't anticipate any more of those all-night sittings that used to go on in 1950-51?
I never mind an all-night sitting myself. One gets a sort of second wind about 4 o'clock in the morning, but I don't think they're a very good way of carrying on parliamentary business.
Sir Alec, most experts in the last 2 days have put a majority of 10 as about the bare minimum that one can govern effectively with. How soon do you expect another election?
Well, I can't possibly tell you that, and I don't think it would be much use speculating. The majority looks like being an overall majority of about 4 to 6, as far as I can make out now on the figure.
Would you anticipate that the socialist government would have to trim very considerably its policies in the next 12 months, say?
Well, I should have thought it would have to be very careful with the very ambitious programs that they had, if they had to carry them through the House of Commons.
What effect do you think this election reversal will have on the Tory party?
I would think that it was a united party. I think it will. Our workers were extremely keen this time. I think the narrow results in a number of seats will make them keener still, and so I would hope that we would gain strength as the months go by.
Do you anticipate that there will be criticism of you within the party, Sir Alec?
I hope not.
Do you intend to remain as leader of the party until the next election?
Well, I am leader of the party, and therefore I intend to lead an opposition, yes.
Do you view opposition with the same enthusiasm as you viewed the Prime Ministership?
Well, yes, I think I'm not afraid of opposition. I haven't been in opposition, of course, for a very long time, and a short time in the 40s, but nevertheless I think it will come reasonably easy, although I say we shall play a constructive part in the Conservative Party in the House of Commons.
Sir Alec, you said the other day at a press conference that you hadn't yet spoken to Mr. Butler about his interview during the campaign. Have you done so now?
Yes, I have, yes.
Would you give any indication of what you said?
No, I don't think so.
Or indeed of what he said?
Except, of course, we're very good friends and colleagues.
Do you intend to remain so?
Certainly. Yes, it never occurred to me that we wouldn't.
In the new House of Commons, Alec, would you seek to woo the Liberals in any way?
I don't think it's my nature to woo anybody particularly, but as I say, I think the thing to do is to look at any proposal that's put before us by the government of the day, whether or not it's supported by the Liberal Party, on its merits. If it has merits, well then no doubt we can facilitate its passage. If it hasn't, we shall oppose it, and it will be for the Liberals to decide what they do.
Sir Alec, I know you've had this put to you before, but I think there is a widespread feeling that Mr. Gordon Walker lost his seat because the Conservative candidate fought on a racial platform. Are you pleased with that result in Smethwick?
I can only really, I think, answer for the party as a whole, and I think this includes our candidate in Smethwick. and that is that I've made it absolutely clear, and this has been endorsed, I think, by every member of the party, that in no circumstances shall racial discrimination come into anything we say or do.
In another election, if you felt that it did come in again, would you repudiate it?
Racial discrimination, I would always repudiate, of course, but we mustn't we can't get away from the fact that immigration is a problem, and a very real problem in a number of districts. And I made quite clear during the campaign that if we were the government of the day, of course, we should have to control it very strictly, because otherwise it brings about the most serious social and economic problems.
So do you anticipate that there will be enormously drastic rethinking within the Conservative Party now as a result of the election?
I hope there are always rethinking going on all the time. And I dare say, if you like to call it drastic rethinking, certainly I think we want to rethink our policies and always keep them up to date and always go on looking ahead. How far I would call it drastic, I don't know, but certainly we must always keep up to date and try and modernize our thinking.
Sir Alec, if I might put my last question to you, what are your immediate movements to be now?
Well, I think immediately I shall probably just pack up my things and move out of Downing Street. Next weekend, I hope we'll go home perhaps for a weekend.
Political considerations apart, Sir Alec, what are your personal regrets, your most, the things that you regret most about surrendering the office of Prime Minister?
Well, I enjoyed being Prime Minister, and I think the responsibility is one that one can carry, and therefore I'm disappointed that I'm not continuing to be Prime Minister. I don't think I have any regrets there. One must take the rough and the smooth in public life. And you can win well at times and you must lose well at others.
Sir Alec, thank you very much for submitting to this further ordeal today.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, until half an hour or so ago, Prime Minister. The news, if you want it, from our central studio: Labour is in. Labour has an absolute majority. Now, in the studio, we have been listening, of course, to what Sir Alec Douglas-Hume has just been saying in the interview which he gave. Ian, what are your reactions?
I think it's clear from that Mr. Wilson is going to enjoy a qualified honeymoon. Sir Alec said that he doesn't, on the whole, like all-night harrying. On the other hand, he's going to take things on their merits and oppose them if he does think they haven't got any merits. This is a clear warning that if Mr. Wilson tries to push through the renationalisation of steel, nationalisation of urban building land, the Conservatives will, I would have thought, go all out to attack it. One of the most interesting things and intriguing things is what is now going to happen about the Polaris deal. Mr. Wilson hopes to go and see the American president, presumably President Johnson, quite soon. Remember that the Polaris deal could be negatived on a single vote of the House of Commons. It's not enshrined in any act of Parliament. It's a deal between two governments, and if Mr. Wilson wanted to annul it or change it, all he had to do is to put down a motion in the House of Commons, and if that motion is passed, the House of Commons has decided. This seems to me to be perhaps the biggest single vote that faces them. Richard.
For the last 363 days, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume has been Prime Minister, working towards an election, thinking about an election. Only in the last few hours or even few minutes, perhaps even just now on television, has he had to confront the problem of being leader of the opposition. And as he pointed out, he hasn't much experience of opposition. He became leader of he went into Parliament in 1931 on a big Conservative landslide then, and he stayed until 45. He was out of Parliament from 45 to 50. He was only in Parliament then for about a year before he succeeded to the peerage in the last days of the Labour government when the Labour Party was being harried. This isn't very extensive experience. Now, just as we're going to see what sort of person Harold Wilson is as Prime Minister, and we don't know, and he doesn't know what sort of person he will be in this role, or prove himself to be, so we don't know what Sir Alec will be like in this role. He may be unexpectedly good, or he may have difficulty in handling his party. However, it's quite easy, it's much easier, I think, to handle a party when you're on a knife edge and you're on the verge of getting back. Don't rock the boat is a very strong mood at keeping a party steady. And so he may not have such a rough passage as all that, as some people have been suggesting.
And a third reaction from Bob Mackenzie.
Well, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume has had the second shortest premiership of anyone in this century. Even shorter was Bonar Law's, lasting about 6-7 months, and his has lasted just almost a year. I think it was interesting to see in the interview the way he hardly seemed to have given a thought to not carrying on as leader of the opposition. The impression was, of course, Now, no doubt that's his intention. On the other hand, I think one has to keep in mind that the evidence provided by Ian MacLeod in his famous article explaining in January of this year what happened, and from his point of view in the leadership struggle, suggests that a majority of the cabinet which was serving around Sir Alec was not in fact in favor of him originally as leader, if we can take Ian MacLeod's account of this. So there's bound to be a fairly deep undercurrent on the part of those who feel that there ought to be someone else leading the party. I quite agree with the view that if Sir Alec were leading a badly defeated party, got with 100 majority against it, you might get in a mood of demoralization and exasperation, a tendency to turn on him at this stage. Now the fact is that it's been such a close-run thing that I think the Conservative Party will hesitate very much indeed to run the risk of any kind of palace revolution against their present leader, because it would seem perhaps to jeopardize the chance, from their point of view, of winning within a year or two a new election.
Some further information from official sources about this explosion of an atomic device bomb, whatever it was, by China. The official announcement that was issued by the Chinese news agency, which means that it is really official, says that the bomb was exploded this morning in the western region of China, that the test was successful, and that this makes Communist China the world's 5th nuclear power. There'll be more news in our television news bulletin in an hour and 40 minutes or so, no doubt, at 6 o'clock. We might even have some more for you ourselves before then.